didn't work very well, so I bought a new remote from Amazon, and it didn't work either. And because I have a computer science background, I take this like as a personal challenge, right? Like no website can stop me. No software program can beat me. So what I figured out is I take my PowerPoint program and I save it in Keynote, which is Apple's version of PowerPoint. And then you can run a Keynote off your iPhone as a remote. And that worked. So take that. This is like a personal thing with me. I will not be defeated by a machine. So what I wanted to talk today about is Reverend Rada asked me to speak at the Jodo Shinshu Center in Berkeley at a leadership council February 1st and 2nd. And I said, well, what am I supposed to talk about? And he goes, just the most important thing that people should know about Buddhism and Jodo Shinshu, Pure Land Buddhism. It's your call, and you have like an hour. So I thought, so this always happens when people teach Buddhism in all different sects. And I'll talk about our sect, but it's true in general. We teach general Buddhism, the early Buddhist teachings of the Buddha and his family, and 2,500 years ago, and then we stop, and then we say, okay, now I'm going to explain our tradition to you, and we leap forward like 1,500 years. And when you do that, it seems like two different things. And like you actually call it general Buddhism, and then sometimes we say, oh, now we're going to teach the Pure Land teachings. And it's like, I didn't even say Buddhism. And I saw a book the other day that said, Pure Land Buddhism, is it really Buddhism? So it is, but this is what happens when you separate like that, as if they're two separate things. So what I'd like to do today, and I've been playing with this idea for a long time, I'd like to retell the story of the Buddha's life from the point of view of our tradition. And every tradition does this. They emphasize and highlight different aspects of the Buddhist life, that arc, that narrative, a model of the path. So in this way, I can teach you general Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism at the same time. So we're going to try to do the first slide from my iPhone. So this is coming, some of this talk is coming from an online class I taught called From Siddhartha to Shakyamuni. It's a 8-lecture course online detailing how he went from being a prince to a Buddha. Yay. That would have been embarrassing if it didn't work. So real quick, this is the online school, everydaybuddhist.org. And what you do is you push that little button there that says Learn More. And I think we changed it to click here because a lot of people aren't 30-year computer programmers. And the little thing said Learn More, and nobody was clicking it. So this is where I'm not very good at web design because when I see something, I just poke it. So I think we changed it to click here. And then it takes you to our online school. It's called Everyday Buddhist, and it has 3 gates. Now, the Buddha had 4 gates. We only have 3 gates, but we're going to add a 4th gate soon. There's a gate to all the basic Buddhist classes, intro classes. There's a gate to everyday practice, more practical, everyday type courses. And then the next one is called Deeper Study. So, to find the class from Siddhartha to Shakyamuni, you would press Buddhist Basics because it is an intro class. And then this pops up. There's about 5 classes, 6 classes listed. And that's the one in the middle that I did. And then this is what it looks like. So what I do in my office, a lot of times I record in my office. I have software called ScreenFlow where it records my desktop and it also records me. And so it gives a very professional look. So that's me down in the right bottom corner. And what they say about podcasts or internet learning is the instructor's face is not that important. You don't really need to see me. even though I think I'm most important on that slide. It's really the Dharma. So the most important thing is the PowerPoint slide and the quality of the audio. So we've worked really hard. So that's what it looks like. And there's about 24 different classes. And now we're done with my sponsor, and we're going to move on to the show. So I wanted to go over, just real quick, some of the characters in this life story of the Buddha. This is the Buddha before. He's Prince Siddhartha, right there. He is trained, he's born into the warrior caste. He's been trained in martial arts, horseback riding, archery, politics, negotiating. So, I mean, he's, what do you call it, the top 1%? He's the elite. He's part of this ruling class, not the spiritual or Brahmanic class. So I kind of think of him as King Henry VIII, very dashing, young, single. He's the future king, right? So it doesn't get any better than that. And then there's his father, King Suddhodana. So he has a firstborn male heir to the throne. This is not his mother. I almost made that mistake at OCBC, and I would have been in big trouble with the Dharma school teachers. His mother died, if you remember, a week after his birth. So this is his aunt, his mother's sister, Mahapajapati, the great. So Maha means great, the great Pajapati. She raises him. It's his aunt, but she raises him as her own son. And then this is the soon-to-be Princess Yoshodhara. This will be his wife. And one of the men at church talked to me after this and said, I mean, I didn't really notice it, and I try to make my talks PG, but he said, that was a pretty sexy outfit that Princess Yoshodhara was wearing. And I'm like, well, I mean, it is India. It's really, really hot. And I don't know. I hope that's okay. And then down here, there's like, I don't know, it looks like an image of somebody on this column. I don't know who it is. One of the Dharma school teachers took a guess and said, maybe that's his attendant, Chana. He has an attendant, like Mr. Bates on Downton Abbey. No? So it's kind of a funny story. We can talk about it later, but the Buddha went through like 5 or 6 attendants from the time he reached enlightenment at 35 to when he reached 55. And it's kind of funny. It's almost like the secretary on Murphy Brown or the drummer of Spinal Tap. I mean, it's, you know, these are real human beings. The Buddha might have been a little bit demanding, and he chewed through attendants pretty fast. There was like, it might have been a mutual agreement, but a lot of them, I think, got fired. So it wasn't until Ananda came along, when the Buddha hit 55, that he had a 25-year run with Ananda as his attendant. And that's another whole interesting story. So this is Chana, the attendant, when he was Prince Siddhartha. So around in his early 20s, the Buddha, this is the story of the 4 gates. This is Chana driving the chariot. And the white horse is Kanthaka. There's an interesting story behind Kanthaka. This is the Buddha's favorite horse. So he's Prince Siddhartha, and he begins to travel outside the kingdom, and he goes through the east gate, and he sees an old man, and he's kind of shocked. He's lived with the elite and the rich and the powerful, and he's never really seen someone old and decrepit and hunched over, maybe with osteoporosis. And he kind of asked Chana, does this even happen to famous rich people? And Chana was kind of mean. He looked at him like, yeah, even rich people get old. We all get old. He looked at him like, really? And then out of the south gate, he sees someone who is very sick and ill. And he hasn't really seen this before either. And I can relate to this story because I've never really seen, the first time I saw a dead body was when I did a Buddhist funeral that was open casket. And I was like 55. So, this kind of stuff is hidden from view. Like I usually see young, healthy people, and older people or people that are ill are usually in a care home or somewhere out of sight. And then the Buddha sees someone who is actually dying. And so I kind of told this story incorrectly. I kind of told it in a more positive way. I kind of thought that we all get sick once in a while during our life, and as we get older, someday we'll die. That doesn't sound that depressing to me. Like, we all get sick, it's normal. A long time from now, we'll die. But I was telling it out of order. The story is, we are going to get older and older and older every day. And as we get older, we get sicker and sicker and sicker. And someday we'll die. So it's a little bit more dramatic that way. And some people say it's pessimistic, but from a Buddhist point of view, we claim that it's realistic. This is something, this is a truth of life that we have to embrace and be aware of. And you don't want to reach 50 or 60 and realize, like I said before, you could have had a V8. Or, how did I get here? You need to be aware of your life. You're chewing up daylight, right? We're chewing up daylight, and you need to make it count. Don't put things off. Okay. So then, the good news, and this maybe we don't emphasize this as much, is the prince meets a monk at the North Gate. And the North Gate, he meets this monk who seems untouched by old age, sickness, and death. And Prince Siddhartha comes up to him and is almost like, "What's wrong with you, man? How can you be happy? There's all this, the truth of life is that we all die." And somehow this monk had transcended old age, sickness, and death. He was awakened. He was an awakened being. And he was glowing and radiant, and he didn't have a care in the world. And this really shook Prince Siddhartha. That there must be another way out than he had understood. And then the other interesting thing about this story is that the direction is very important. He's moving from the East Gate to the South Gate to the West Gate to the North Gate. He's moving in a clockwise fashion. And I didn't know this, but in India, in Indian culture, it's kind of understood that truth moves clockwise. It flows in a clockwise fashion. So you could argue that the ultimate truth, infinite reality, Amida Buddha, is kind of compelling him and pushing him along the way. His path has changed from a linear path from prince to king to kind of this circular path of following ultimate truth. So it's almost like he's being compelled and pushed towards awakening. So he meets this monk, and in our tradition, a deep, profound aspiration was awoken inside of him. They call it hongan, a desire to seek awakening. So his life takes a 180-degree turn when he meets this monk. And so he wants a different path in life. He wants to emulate the monk now and not the king, which causes family problems because he doesn't want to go into the family business. And this is a caste system. And Americans tend to be upset with this story because at 29, he leaves his wife and child to seek wisdom and awakening. But they were in the castle. They're very well off. They have servants. They're very well taken care of. And the reason why the Buddha had to leave his home is because of the caste system. You can't choose. You're born into your destiny. You're born into your trade. You don't have a choice like in America where you can do whatever you want. So the way it's explained is in Indian culture, the only way to change your destiny or your path in life is you actually have to move. You have to remove yourself from that family setting or that community to develop a different identity. And what Indian people were really upset at Prince Siddhartha for wasn't that he left his wife and children, it was that he went AWOL, that he abandoned his post, that there's no one left in line to take over for the king. That's what they were most upset about. It was an issue of military prudence, not familial obligation. So the Buddha goes out to the edge of town at 29, and he cuts off his hair. He gives Channa his silks, his earrings, his necklace, and he abandons Kantaka here, who's really brokenhearted, and he puts on the saffron robes as an ascetic and begins to practice a spiritual life. And for the first 3 years or so, he practices yogic concentration, profound meditation. So he's trying to control his state of mind. And he supposedly does very well, but he finds that it's not permanent or fixed. When he comes out of his meditation, his mind goes back to its normal state. And I think you could see the 5 fellow students. He has 5 monks that are following him. So he leaves Udaka, his teacher, and he begins to practice ascetic practice. And it took me a while to figure this out, but this is much, much different than monasticism. Monasticism is communal living, like being in a dorm. There's a lot of rules. When I was at UCLA, there was a rule that you weren't allowed to go out on the balcony of your window for any reason, because you could fall or jump or commit suicide. And one of my friends, he accidentally locked himself out of his room, and he should have gone downstairs and gotten a passkey from the front desk, but he was in a hurry, and his neighbor was there, and both windows were open because it was hot and it was in the spring, so he just jumped out and hopped back into his room and opened the door. But that broke one of the rules, and he was kicked out of the dorms like the next day. And I think it was just the dorms. I don't think it was the school. But there's certain rules that you have to follow when you live in a communal lifestyle, and that's monasticism. Asceticism is where it's a very minimalistic life. You eat very little, you have little water, you sit in meditation, you don't do many activities. And so this is what the Buddha looked like after 2 or 3 years of ascetic practices. He's near death, very thin. And so he abandons ascetic practice as well, because he realizes the only way to really reach awakening is to die. And that seems to kind of defeat. I know there's a conflict there. And he sees that conflict. So he bathes, he begins to eat, and he sits under a Bodhi tree. And he realizes initial awakening in the morning under a Bodhi tree. And I wanted to share you this. This is one of the quotes when the Buddha was under the Bodhi tree. A Brahmin god, a Hindu god, comes to the Buddha, and the Brahma appeared to the Buddha and pleaded with him by saying, "There must be a wise person who has the knowledge to understand the Buddha Dharma in this world. Please preach the Buddha Dharma." So initially the Buddha wanted to sit in silence and be a lone monk, maybe like the monk he saw under the North Gate. But the Hindu god actually begs him to get up and teach and put his awakening experience into words for others to listen to and be part of the path. And so one scholar says this is the beginning of Pure Land Buddhism. It's not 1,000 years later in China. It's when the Buddha first begins to stand and puts his awakening experience into words. It's when he first begins to teach and awakening becomes verbal, is when Pure Land Buddhism starts. And then the Buddha gets up from the Dharma, from the Bodhi tree. He takes that challenge and he begins to teach to the 5 monks that had been following him. And this is the beginning of the Dharma. So we did Tisarana today, right? We did Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. We get the first jewel under the Bodhi tree. This is the second jewel. And then they all reach awakening. And he tells them to go out and create their own Sanghas. So now we have a Sangha of 5. And so just within that first week, we have the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And then the Buddha teaches from 35 to 80, so that's 45 years. And he dies at 80 years old. And this is the position, much different than under the Bodhi tree. He's between twin sala trees, and he's lying down. his head is pointing north and he's facing west. And he realizes complete and total enlightenment in the evening. And so these two events are always kept separate. There's an initial awakening experience under the Bodhi tree, and then he faces the Western Pure Land and realizes complete and total awakening on the eve of his death. And so this idea of the Pure Land, of reaching complete and total awakening as one nears death, is in general Buddhism. I mean, he's facing the Western Pure Land paradise. So in Buddhism, there's actually two awakening events. There's the initial event at 35, which Zen calls Satori, and our tradition calls Shinjin. And there's also that Hongan, or awakening the innermost desire, when he met the monk at the fourth gate. So you have this desire to seek, then you have initial awakening, then you have a life of practice, and then you reach complete and total enlightenment as one nears death. And so this biography of the historical Buddha contains the actual understanding of the teachings from the Pure Land point of view. So when the Buddha dies, this is saying number 6 in our service book. This is Shakyamuni Buddha's deathbed address as he dies. He says, "Therefore, be a lamp unto yourself. Be a refuge to yourself. Take yourself to no external refuge. Hold fast to the truth as a lamp. Hold fast to the truth as a refuge. Look not for a refuge in anyone beside yourself." So this is kind of a Pure Land message, that you'll find awakening and enlightenment in the teachings. By listening to the Dharma is where you'll find the Buddha. It's not a physical body. He left the teachings for us, and we can experience his reality by listening to his words and studying the teachings. So this is a story of the historical Buddha, but the elements of the story line up very well with kind of the orthodoxy or the theology of Pure Land Buddhism. And so we don't really have to separate the two into two different groups. And so these points of the narrative that I've emphasized are the points that Shinran emphasizes 1,500 years later in Japan. And sometimes general Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism sound different in terms of the vocabulary because they were developed in a different time and place. Just like the way I explain Buddhism is much, much different than the way somebody maybe would explain it in China. But it's still the essence, it's still the same core story played out through the Buddha's life as a model for us to emulate and to use as to aspire to. So I just wanted to share this to you. This is the most important thing about Buddhism in 15 minutes. And I did 2 talks at once. Thank you very much. Please join me in Gassho.